Hi, I'm Richard Petty. I'm a photographer in St. Louis, and this is a beginner's guide to digital photography. To be a great photographer with digital photography, you really don't need a lot of fancy equipment. It's your skill and experience that makes the great pictures rather than the equipment. I do recommend that you get yourself a camera that allows you to manually control the aperture and the film speed and the speed of the exposure, and that you get yourself a really good light meter. This is an example of a light meter, and you don't really need a super fancy light meter. This one's fairly fancy because I do a lot of studio work and wedding work, but still just a simple light meter to help you understand the exposure. Now, the exposure is the total amount of light that hits the sensor in your camera, which is the equivalent of film in film photography. And there are three things that determine what that exposure ought to be, or how much light is reaching your sensor. One of them is the aperture. The aperture is an iris that gets smaller and larger inside your lens and allows more or less light to come in. The larger the number for your aperture, called f-stops, the less amount of light that it brings in. Then there is the actual shutter speed, and that is how long the shutter is actually open, allowing light to reach the sensor before it closes. And then the third thing is the actual sensitivity of it, which is in digital photography is called the ISO. And I'm not sure I even remember what ISO stands for, but that's the old equivalent of film speed. Now, what you want to do is you want to juggle those three things in order to get the total amount of light that's correct for your exposure. Now, usually in your light meter, you can move the aperture, or that iris f-stop, up and down, and you'll see the film speed, or you'll see the shutter speed go up and down in the opposite direction to compensate for it, so that you end up with a perfect exposure. And you can achieve different effects by balancing those. If you want to go to a much higher number in your f-stops, you'll get tremendous depth of field. You'll be able to see up close and all the way off in the distance in really sharp focus. If you go in the opposite direction and use a fast film speed and wide open aperture, then you'll have a narrow depth of field. Like if you want, for instance, to take a picture where you have someone in sharp focus, but you want the background to be a little blurred, you can do that by balancing those two things. But my best advice for learning digital photography is get a camera and just take lots and lots and lots of pictures, so that eventually you get to the point where you've mastered your equipment and you can think about the composition and the picture without having to juggle with the controls on the camera. You know just instinctively what to use.